On Saturday, the 3rd of February 2024, INEC, with respect to the court order, conducted by-elections and reruns in about 80 local governments in 26 states. The report from that exercise has raised many questions and has raised many concerns as to 2027 general election already. We're going to discuss all of that on the show today, but for now, this is Viewpoint, where we discover perspective and embrace dialogue. My name is Oluwapelubi Awe, and to discuss the entire incident on Saturday is a political analyst at Veegil Media or Diawa AI. How are you?
I'm very fine.
I'm glad to have you on the show today.
Yeah, you see, despite the controversies surrounding the outcome of the 2023 elections, there's been cautious optimism about Saturday's rerun and by-elections conducted by the Electoral umpire INEC. Some believe that with the approval of the 40 billion naira budget for the electoral body this year, it should have conducted a free, credible and fair election.
Absolutely.
Not only on Saturday, but also in the Edo and Ondo gubernatorial polls. But all in all, as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, it's another litmus test.
All right, we're going to get into the issues today. But before we go on, do well to follow us on all our social media platforms to hear our views and for us to also hear your views as well. Now to the issues. 2 days to the election, INEC's spokesperson made a promise to the press that INEC would make sure that the election this time around would be smoother than the one we have previously had. But the report from that exercise that day seems not to match the promise made. What do you think?
Well, in my own view, my own opinion, we had the 2023 elections conducted in February. Now, this was an episode before the elections, during the elections, and after the elections. Another test was carried out on INEC concerning the off-cycle elections later on in November, if we recall, in Kogi, Bayelsa, and Imo states. This was marked by all sorts of irregularities. Now, there's no point restating promises you cannot live up to. Why? Because you've planned to fail instead of you actually planned to fail. You didn't plan at all, because if you actually planned, there won't be lapses. And if at all you have even planned, you make room for unforeseen contingencies to actually be taken care of. Let's take, for instance, now you're conveying materials now over to a riverine area like Bayelsa. What if the boat capsizes? What measures have you put in place to make sure that there are preventive measures to make sure the boat doesn't actually capsize in that riverine area? These are factors we should look into. So when you go restating promises in certain republics where there is a democratic dispensation, and those democratic dispensations require an electoral feature to bring in an executive, it becomes a problem. That is where this confidence in the electoral body will begin to fade, and this apathy begins to raise its ugly head.
Right. Well, what we heard from the last election was that we had cases of the things we've always heard about. For instance, late arrival of electoral materials, you had violence, you had vote buy. These are things that have always happened over the years. Well, I'd like for us to speak on each, just one after the other. Let's talk about who is responsible for late arrival of electoral materials on election day.
Well, we cannot just blame the head alone, because I want to believe that the head must have assigned responsibilities to individuals who are working with the electoral body. Mahmoud Yakubu is not only INEC. You have resident electoral commissioners who are also handling elections within the states. Mahmoud Yakubu is just the number one man. There were you have Atairu Jega, a former INEC chairman. You have Maurice Ibu, another INEC chairman. But you are the head. What measures have you actually put in place to make sure that even the people under you are on their toes? This is where the Electoral Act now comes in. The Electoral Act doesn't necessarily need to cover politicians in their mishaps or undoings or wrongdoings during elections. Responsibilities which are not adhered to by electoral officials also need to be stipulated there in that Electoral Act. If you default in this particular venture, these are the consequences. And those consequences need to actually be stern, so that every 4 years or every off cycle or every rerun of by-elections, if there's any mishap, you know what you're going to stand up to. We hear of electoral anomalies. After the election, we don't hear of those cases again. It therefore means that those acts are not actually firm or stern enough to even deal with those discrepancies. So if there are rules and regulations on ground to make sure that excesses of electoral officials are actually put in place, I think they will sit up. Because you can't tell me an election which was planned months ahead, you have not put in measures in place. That's not an excuse. Knowing the geographical location of a particular state. Let's take, for instance, let's use Lagos State. Lagos is not a child's play when it comes to election. You know that yes, there are a certain number of polling units, certain number of local governments, certain number of wards. And then you do your map out, you do the mathematics, and when you're done doing the mathematics, you do the minus and subtraction, or the addition and plus, and then you know how are you going to move. If you need to move in, okay, so time, there's traffic, we don't need you on the road, right? Because this is election day. So you have no excuse when you're delivering electoral items. Another tactics will now be, I would say, delay tactics. Why? Because the politicians also come into play in all these whole discrepancies. They don't help matters, the political elite or the political class. A situation whereby, because you have to win a particular polling unit, you now know that yes, if they definitely know that yes, they're going to lose that polling unit. Now the question now is, what do we do to win that polling unit? Because they don't like us. Or what do we do since they don't like us and the opposition is actually going to win that polling unit? What do we do? That is where they now begin to scuttle the activities of either they make sure that they delay the delivery of those electoral items, or peradventure the electoral materials have gotten to that polling unit, they go and disrupt the venue. That's where you now hear, okay, yes, the election is inconclusive.
Well, I think for every delegate from INEC taking the materials to a particular center, there should be somebody from the security forces who will go with them to deliver the material. Now, if you have a case where these people are trying to stop these guys from, have there been incidents of that, you heard of that before, where materials heading towards the centers have been disrupted by violent people, area boys, scouts?
Definitely. I began mentioning that while I was explaining. Now, the security operatives now who are meant to even accompany, if we recall, the electoral umpire INEC had to partner with, it was common now with the Air Force. Why? Because, there's no traffic in the air. It's the most efficient form of transportation, though expensive. Now you look at it, conveying electoral materials via air and upon touching down at the tarmac, it's still going on land. Now the question is, how furnished or how well furnished are those security operatives to make sure that even they actually do away with unforeseen violence or tragedies that will mar the activities of the election? That's another question. Because some of them are so gullible. Why? Because of the corruption-based system we find ourselves. If the security agent is well catered for, he won't be that gullible enough to give in for cheap bribe. And when that cheap bribe comes in, he mans the next 4 years of a particular constituency or a particular state. So we need to get rid of corruption. That is where the security operatives now come in. Because, just in the off-cycle elections, there was a video where a particular security operative was caught with cartons of cash. Why? Because he had to mar or frustrate the efforts or thwart the efforts of the electoral process.
These are critical issues that you have mentioned. And I think one other thing that I've seen happen again and again, and it begs the question, can't we go past this? For instance, vote buying. You have snatching of ballot boxes. Can't we go beyond this? I want to put it to you. Can't we go beyond all of these issues?
We can go beyond this if we have a very good surveillance system. For instance, now let's use the US now, for instance. Let's use the Capitol, the Congress. When they vote, I've never heard them say the ayes have it. There's an electronic system of voting. Fine, I want to believe that recently that should be adopted or must have been adopted in the National Assembly. But why does it take long if we find ourselves in a jet age or rocket age? Why? Because a particular people know that it's going to frustrate their efforts. So you know what they do? They make sure they dim the light of enlightenment, not to illuminate the knowledge of the electorate. That's another thing. Because once they know that you're knowledgeable about some things, they know that you want to actually fight for your right, which is rightfully yours. So they make sure that they dampen your morale. dim the light so you don't get enlightened.
Well, I think before we came on the show, we were discussing about the fact that people sell their votes for a pack of Indomie and then and then struggle for 4 years. I think it's still prevalent. I remember some years back in Ondo State, I found people collecting 3,000 naira. They said, Diboko Sobe. That means vote for us and cook stew. Now, would that still sustain you for 4 years?
Now, that's it. As exciting and as comical it may sound, let's be factual about this. For instance, now, you want to use that stew, that means that if they're actually giving you 4 spoons of rice, that means when the stew finishes, what happens? In course of talking briefly with you, I gave one kind of proverbial, some sort of a proverbial statement. Don't give the person fish all the time. What happens when you're incapacitated and you can't give the fellow fish anymore?
Yeah.
I prefer you should give or hand over that person a hook. And not just handing over the person the hook. The fellow might ask you, what do you want me to do with this? Teach that person how to use that
how
hook.
to use the hook.
So when you teach that person how to use the hook, he's able to fetch fish.
Absolutely.
So growth is like continuous. So when another generation comes, they build on the existing structure which has been in place rather. Now you give a fellow noodles. Let's use Indomie Belleful, which is common now. Now you give that fellow 4. That means you're eating 1 per year. Because every administration is 4 years, depending on how greedy that administration may be. The administration is greedy like Zimbabwe, where they want to live or rule till their kingdom come. It's a situation whereby, okay, fellow, well, I'm amending the constitution. I'm going to stay for 6 years. It gives you 6 Indomie Belleful. So you're eating 1 per year.
1 per year.
So the rest of the 365 days, you go languishing in abject poverty or destitution. That's another thing. So I began by saying it's a case whereby you need to fend for the citizenry with their hooks and teach them how to use that.
How to use the hook. And I think that's so correct. But again, to speak more about the election on Saturday, we heard of the case in Enugu South where the EO and the SPO did not arrive on time. And when they did arrive, in fact, from reports, we learned that they had security forces on ground. All of the guys, soldiers were there, immigration officers were there, the police had to come in to make things calm. And when these persons arrived, they came with photocopied materials. And it's amazing how we are still doing this in 2024. Looking at the amount that was budgeted for this year for INEC, 40 billion, you would expect that this thing should have been sorted. But would you say that there are politicians who are behind the scene orchestrating these moves? Now, bearing in mind the season we are in where things are hard for many people, do you think that we have people in the elite class who are actually pulling strings and making things difficult for us to move on?
I will take a cue from there. Pulling strings. Yes. So these politicians will actually pull these strings in their favor. Why? Because I was discussing with someone earlier on. Politics is all about interest. If there's no interest, forget about it. What do I stand to gain? Politicians are always after a particular constituency. Why? Because of what they will be able to derive from there. Let's use Rockefeller now in the US. Rockefeller was in charge of a particular industry. Vanderbilt was in charge of a particular industry. Now, the same thing is replicated here in Nigeria. If you have a particular family, they call them the aristocrats or cabal or bourgeoisie. Now, if you have a particular set of people like that on board, they want to make sure that their interest is preserved, approaching it politically. Why? Because of resources. Those resources are beneficial for them. And that's why you hear their families become not just some kind of a family, but I'll say a dynasty. Why? Because generations unborn are still coming to rule. Why? Because of the feat they've achieved based on their interest, approaching it politically. Let's use, for instance, gold now, which is a natural resource. A particular family knows that the gold reserves in a particular region, a particular constituency, a particular state. Now the question is, how do we fight for that place intellectually? There's no need picking up arms or clashing swords. Let's go and vote. Our parties will win. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to exercise any democratic right you need to exercise, which is your suffrage during elections. Now you have voted. Who emerges winner? That is where this fellow now comes on board. Now these by-elections now have actually come in place, and politics is all about interest, like I began by saying. It's a game plan. Now if you look at it again, these by-elections and reruns came up. Why? Because either one person was deceased or one person had to resign or step down. Why? Because he had ministerial appointments or appointment as a commissioner. Now he is now in a minister's board, or the other fellow is now on a commissioner's board. Now a rerun is going to take place, and then he still comes under that political party to serve the interests of the fellow who has just exited that office as a minister or as a commissioner. So it's all game plan.
The game plan.
It's a chess game.
You see that there.
So if you're not looking at it 5 steps ahead or 3 steps ahead, you need to get your game right.
Now, I think that's something to also think about, because you would imagine that it's not the general election. It's an election that is happening because of a few things. And you would imagine that you would have more persons, more police forces in these states, these local governments to make things happen there. If it was a general election, for instance, you would say, okay, everywhere, you put soldiers everywhere, police everywhere. But this is happening in selected states, and we cannot still guarantee a free and fair, but more than that is a credible electoral process. Now that, for anybody watching from the outside who is a citizen, will begin to have fear. And we have been told already that our voters apathy in Nigeria is growing by the day. So what would you say to people how would you encourage somebody who has seen again and again that his vote doesn't count? How would you encourage the person, or what would you say to that? I
will console that particular apolitical person with the usual local parlance. They say it will be better. So I will just console that. But on a lighter note, we still owe ourselves a duty to vote. Because we don't vote, we're sinning against ourselves politically. Let's say the truth. It's like when Obama was contesting for elections. It was one vote that saved him in his second term.
That's true.
It was one vote that saved him. Now the question is, we exercise our civic rights by coming outside to vote. But over time, because of the confidence lost in the electoral umpire, not just in one dispensation, but not 2 dispensations, countless dispensations, who it's a selection game and not an election game. And the citizens have grown to understand this. And they live in this climate of fear. If you open your jaw, you end up in a floor. So that's the fear now that has been instilled. But how does this actually checkmate some things? Those in authority are the ones actually controlling this. Now, this is things like this that actually skyrocketed a hashtag in 2020, the NSAS. It was not just an attack against the police. It was against the anomalies in the whole society. Imagine you're going on the road there and you're being harassed by the police for no just thing, which they go as far as dipping your hands in your pocket. That's invasion of privacy. So these things now need to be checkmated, starting from top to bottom. The office is corrupt, the family is corrupt, even the church is corrupt these days. I was hearing a song the other time. I said the pastor, when a particular member gives his offering, the pastor will have to kneel down to pray for the fellow who has dropped a large sum of offering.
Well, these are critical issues that we're talking about today, and I think anyone who is having the fear to say, I don't think my vote counts anymore, I think it's just election, not election, the person must have taken some words of wisdom for what you have said. But again, we also must talk about the fact that we have 2027 election coming. We still have more elections going to happen this year. We have Edo coming this year.
Yes.
We also have Ondo coming this year. So there are people who are sitting back and also seeing this thing and seeing how that INEC has not been able to make things right even in 2024. Do you have an insight as to what Edo election and Ondo election would look like later this year?
So, Edo elections, Ondo elections, now these are neighboring states. They are just next door neighbors. You have the Sunshine States and the Heartbeats. 2 common alliances or mottos these states are known as. Now, will the sun actually shine in Ondo states? Why? Because they are actually having issues coming from the deceased former governor, Akeredolu. Now, his deputy has taken over, Lucky. Fine, he can contest. But the internal crisis within these political parties, will they actually allow the parties work efficiently so that they grab that seat or retain that seat? That's another question. Because once there's in-house crisis within these political parties, they can't actually achieve the ultimate goal, which is the #1 seat of the state. Now that's Ondo State. Coming to Edo State, which is the Heartbeat, if I could fall back to the slang which they used in getting at the current chief executive, Edo no be Lagos. It's a question of you can't come here and be dominant. I want to believe that the people of Edo State should also know who they should actually come out when they exercise their civic rights and responsibilities. But irrespective of that, just like Ondo State, political parties there are also having their own in-house crisis. We've got heavyweights from APC like the Izeyamo and the Osumbos, and going over to PDP, who the current deputy governor, and then the Igodalo, who is also coming up on board also. Now, another area we should look at it in both states is this rotational zoning as to who actually has to come on board. If the state has agreed in the interest of peace, because everything is interest, whether it's Ondo State or Edo State, if a state has agreed that, okay, this zone, it's your turn to take over for the interest of peace, for the people, let there be harmony, fine, you let it be. Because the number one seat is not a do or die affair. Another thing is, what manifesto have you got on board? I don't see politicians coming up with manifesto these days. When they come up with ideologies which they cannot live up to. And they end up being verbally confrontational, which is totally against the Electoral Act of 2022. Now, these are things that need to be checkmated. I started by saying earlier on when you asked a question about the electorate or citizenry being enlightened. But they are not. If they are enlightened and they see all this fracas, they will not really key into even the mega rallies they are even coming for, because that is all just deception, psychophancy, let me put it that way.
You see that, but anybody, like I said, anybody who still sits back and studies the happenings, what happened last Saturday, would be afraid to go out to vote when it's time for Ondo Edo State election. And so I would say that INEC has its role to play. So for instance, you have it that vote buying, you can't really, in entirety, you can't really stop vote buying. In a way, in an environment where poverty is, prevalent. But how about creating an environment where people can go out to vote and vote with confidence? How about creating that environment for them? So if you're going to tie what happened last Saturday to the elections happening this year in Ondo and Edo, what would you say INEC should put in place first to ensure that more persons are confident to come out to vote? And I won't be surprised if so many persons don't go out to vote. I won't be surprised. Second, to ensure that the environment is created. What would you say?
Well, I would begin to suggest profiling my own solution.
Okay.
That let's use the banking system. You don't need to walk into the bank before you make your transfer. You have so many available options at your disposal. First off, you have the USSD code, which you can use to run the transfer. If you've got your internet in place, you've got data in place, you can do the internet banking. Just in case your data is not going and the network is poor, you can't actually utilize the USSD. There's a POS agent next door. Instead of stressing yourself to get to the bank. Why? Because you will still waste money for transport. You need to be considerate when it comes to cash. Now, this is a method or mode of transfer and available options in the banking sector or the financial sector. If the electoral umpire can adopt voting from phones, because when you go to the polling booth, you don't let people see who you voted for, right? And you put it into the ballot box. So if you're in the comfort of your home, they have every registered phone number has an NIN or a BVN. Now with that NIN, your national identification number, it's used to track you anywhere. So if that INEC can use it to interweave their way, developing an apparatus to make sure that people can vote from anywhere. Even now there's this cry for Nigerians in diaspora to actually also vote when elections are taking place. So whether that will be adopted anytime soon or the bill has passed the first stage, second reading or third reading, that's another question of food for thought we need to wine and dine about. Now the question now is, if the electoral umpire INEC can adopt a system of mobile voting whereby you don't necessarily need to get to the polling booth, I think that would be a very good step in the right direction. And it will be a welcome development to at least alleviate the fears of even the electorate that, okay, they are bringing something new. Let's see how it's going to work. But another question is, will it also be merged the same way the BVAs and the IREVs, the uploadings, were also merged? There were so many discrepancies because in our part of the world in this climate, we have a way of looking for or capitalizing in the inadequacies of a particular feature. That's the thing. I would just call it natural greed. And when it comes to greed, the needy suffers.
But talking about the rights of people that want to vote, and I think we also spoke about before coming to the studio that we've seen cases where security agencies are given beer to drink when they should actually stand and ensure that right things are done.
See, that's a case of bribery and corruption in broad daylight. They haven't shared, let's say, for instance, a prominent chairman or a prominent politician at the grassroots level in a particular polling unit. He would have been told that by the men at the top, we need to win that constituency. And this is not a joke. This is not a lie. It's what happens before elections or even during elections. They will tell those at the grassroots, who is who at the grassroots, we need to get that particular polling unit. We need to get that particular ward. We need to get that particular constituency. Millions of billions are doled out. Millions of billions actually meant to take care of the citizenry during the administration ends up in the coffers of just a few, and then they come out with disposable plates of rice. And when the election is over, you see the whole place littered. Even those that came to stand under the basking sun are not even beneficiaries of the so-called food in question. You still have to even fight for it when you're even fighting for your vote. So it's appalling, it's sad that the electorates are being taken advantage of at the slightest instance, at any opportunity. These, what I call them, miscreants have.
Well, I think you suggested that we should try to adopt the idea of using the phone to vote. And sometimes, for anyone watching this, I guess there'll be questions around the fact that we were not able to manage BVAs. We were not able to manage that. How do we move from this point to that point when we have not actually mastered how this works? But I think the last question I would have for you on the show will be that sometimes, for those of us who are still in Nigeria, it's just to be hopeful that one day things will get better.
Like I said, they go better.
But do you think things will actually get better soon? And also looking at 2027 from now, do you think any good thing can still happen between now and 2027?
Well, there's something I've always known about Nigerians is that we are damn too resilient. I'll take a cue from Fela's song, Suffering and Smiling. I was in traffic the other time and people were sweating inside the bus and they were fanning themselves. And just to console themselves, they just asked a very funny question. It's common knowledge that public transport, which they call Danfo, doesn't have an AC. They told the driver to put on his AC. The place is hot. People started laughing inside the anger in the traffic. So I would just say Nigerians should just be optimistic. That's the only thing I have to say. To be optimistic. Not everyone is bad. Not everyone is good. We just have to be optimistic.
Be optimistic, to believe that something good will still happen in our country one day very soon. And just like Odiawa said, if you are in Ondo State or Edo State and which having the election later this year, you don't have to be afraid. Just go out and cast your vote and hope and believe that things will happen in your direction. It's been a good time having you on the show, but we also want to hear your viewpoint. We want to hear your view and hear what you have to say on this issue, about electoral issue. All right. Do want to follow us on all our social media platforms. See you on the next one.